people are doing. So, oh man, exams. What can I say? They are the most tedious and horrendous crap that anyone has to deal with in their entire life, and it's horrible. It always has to come up with the most terrible timing with the iPhone 15 Pro Max at least. And well, that's precisely why I'm so very late. But that crap has been dealt with. I can finally make these camera comparisons. And another good news is that this is probably one of the last exams that I have to give for a very long time to come. So that's amazing. And well, if you're still interested, I would tell you this much. This comparison, oh yeah, it's gonna be fun as hell because there's a lot to talk about. So let's jump in. And simple shot, I know, but just look at the difference. It's pretty intense. The iPhone has like a metric ton of contrast right there, while the S23, it's very bright, a little too bright for my liking. I like the contrast on the iPhone. I think something in between the two would be ideal. That's basically how it would look, based on the realistic conditions. But yeah, I would say that the iPhone doesn't look particularly bad, especially when you consider the fact that it's not completely blowing out the highlights in the background, which is a massive deal if you know anything about previous iPhones. Now this is exactly how the S23 looks 99% of the time. Fairly high contrast, like it's basically the same as the iPhone with just a little bit more saturation. That's the only difference. That's what I expected at the previous shot, but that didn't quite happen. I'm not exactly sure why. As for dynamic range, oh man. Like, I've been waiting to talk about this because at this point everybody knows that the iPhone 15 Pro Max finally has good dynamic range. That is something that did not exist in previous generations, like the iPhone 12, the 13, the 14. All three of them had some of the most horrendous dynamic range that you could ever hope for. They had a feature called Smart Asia that just didn't work, or made things even worse. Now Smart Asia works. Hey, it works perfectly. I mean, look at the detail in the clouds way back in the background. It's basically as good as the S23, which is a big deal because the S23, as you might also know, it has incredible dynamic range. And do I need to reiterate, because it looks even better than the S23 in this case. Like, this is the afternoon sun, and so the fact that they've fixed it, it's a huge relief. And also, about damn time. What the hell took them so long? I have no idea. But one thing they did not fix, which was a problem last year as well, is that you cannot take any good main camera close-ups with the iPhone. Now the S23 with the new 200 megapixel sensor also can't get as close as, let's say, the S22 Ultra could, but it can get significantly closer than the iPhone. I mean, just look at the difference. It's pretty self-explanatory right there. As for the Ultrawide, well, it's a similar story. It looks really nice on both. I do think once again the S23 just gives you a little bit more shadow detail, while the iPhone, it just comes in with a massive load of contrast. It's not bad dynamic range or anything like that, just want to make that clear, but it is a lot of contrast that you're gonna get on the iPhone. And personally, I like it a lot because I really like high contrast. Like, it's one of the reasons I like the Pixel so much. It has incredible contrast, and I like the iPhone in this case for the same reason. Another Ultrawide, this time completely backlit, and I mean, you can tell that the dynamic range is not a problem anymore. I'm telling you right now, if I'd taken this shot with the iPhone 14 Pro or the Pro Max, the entire sky, every bit of blue that you see in the background would have been completely blown out and it would have looked white. And that's essentially the problem that Apple finally solved. It's not like they could not have solved it before. I think it's more about they just decided to solve it now. But hey, credit where due. It is definitely working. It looks so much better now. I can actually recommend this phone for photography because of this very reason. Now, of course, zoom. This is also something that the iPhone 15 Pro Max has improved on. And well, this is the ultrawide camera. Of course, it looks fantastic on both. This is a basic shot, and let's face it, they have excelled at much worse situations. Yes, the main camera, again, looks really nice. The major difference is that the S23 has a little bit more shadow detail, more saturation, while the iPhone comes in with a lot more contrast, which personally I prefer. Now then, the 3x on the S23. This is optical zoom on the S23, of course, and it looks good. It's basically as good as it can get. And the iPhone, on the other hand, this one comes in with a 2x sensor crop. It works exceptionally well. The 2x sensor crop is basically as close to optical zoom as you can get on any smartphone. And then of course we have the 5x zoom. Now this is a new sensor on the iPhone, and it works well, it looks really nice, and I don't really have anything to complain about here. As for 10x, I mean, it is gonna look exceptional on the S23. It is the only real long-range zoom camera that you can get, especially if you really want that 10x and then some. Now, high resolution. See, the interesting thing is, last year the 48 megapixel sensor on the iPhone, it was very good, and it produced significant amounts of detail, even more than the 108 megapixel sensor that we had on the S22 Ultra. But the S23 has improved its game. We have a 200 megapixel sensor, but we also get a bin down 50 megapixel mode, which I think is perfect, and I think that's exactly how you want to use the high res. And it really shows, like, the 48 megapixel sensor doesn't really produce as much detail or as much realistic detail, because there's a bit of sharpening going on the iPhone that I can see very clearly. The S23 has significantly less of that, and that is exactly what I'm talking about. Why the 50 megapixel mode being binned down from the 200 megapixels, it really works well, and it produces some insane amount of detail for a good file size, good processing and all that jazz. Of course, you can use 200 megapixels, there's nothing stopping you, and it does look good, especially when you have a good amount of light. It can produce a hell of a lot of detail. Like, this is definitely more detailed as opposed to the iPhone, and for obvious reasons. I mean, it's more than 4 times the resolution. You would expect that much, or at least like some amount of difference to be there. There's not 4 times more detail, naturally, but there is more on the S23 Ultra. Now, of course, and I almost forgot about this one, the iPhone can take 24 megapixel regular shots. Now, you might know this already, but the S23, even though it has 200 megapixels, it will take regular 12 megapixel shots, bin down. That's for good processing, consistency, all that jazz, but the iPhone promises to do the same with 24 megapixels. So the question really arises that, yes, it can produce consistently good images, but can it actually produce double the detail? Well, no, it's not going to be double the detail. It's never exactly proportional to the numbers, ever. But it is more detail. It is less over-sharpening on the iPhone by quite a bit. And compared to the S23 Ultra, at least, this is a massive difference, especially like we are zooming in at 500% and we are seeing a pretty significant difference between the two. Now, as for macro, you see, I'm not sure why, maybe it was the subject, but the S23 really struggled with taking a macro shot. I couldn't even get closer than this, even though I know for a fact that the S23 can get closer than this. But anyways, the iPhone had no such issue, and you can see it is producing a ludicrous amount of detail. It looks really nice in this case. Now for selfies and portraits, well, let's just say this much. I know for a fact that both these phones can handle regular daylight conditions easily. It's not even a question. So I'm not even gonna bother with those. This right here, most of these shots, I've taken them during an overcast day, indoors, so medium to low light, technically. Not enough for night mode or anything like that, but enough to make these phones struggle. And that's kind of what's happening, because I can see that the iPhone is producing less detail than the S23, and it is also not as bright. Although I do kind of like the contrast on the iPhone. And it's a very similar story here. I mean, this is backlit and both have very good dynamic range. That stuff is good, but the detail level is just a pinch higher on the S23, just a little, and you probably can't even see it after you do compression, but trust me, it is there. Now, a backlit selfie, of course, it's my comparison. There has to be backlit selfies. And there are other backlit shots as well, we'll get to those. Anyways, I think both are doing well, but the iPhone is actually better in this case, as opposed to the previous shots, which were easier and the iPhone was suffering. So I don't really know what happened, but yeah, turns out it turns it up to 11 with backlit shots, because I'm brighter, I look brighter, and the detail level is also somehow higher, and the highlight preservation is the same across the board. Now, selfie portraits. See, I believe for a fact that the iPhone has really good selfie portraits when it comes to the edge detection, the processing, the skin tones, all that jazz. It's all good. It's about as good as the S23, if not maybe sometimes even a little bit better. But the reason I think the S23 takes it is that it allows us to take proper wide-angle selfie portraits, as opposed to the cropped in, the forced crop in that you have to do on the iPhone. And yeah, the selfies or the selfie portraits will look good on the iPhone, but I just think the flexibility just makes it worthwhile for the S23 Ultra. It just works in my case, and I really prefer much wider selfies. And the iPhone can go wider than the S23 as well, so the fact that we are limited to a cropped in selfie portrait, it really bothers me. Now the night selfies, see, this is interesting. So both phones tend to use some form of front-facing flash when they're taking these shots. It was very dark. You can see the background looks smudgy and artifacty because it was really dark again. But the S23 is significantly more subtle with that front-facing flash. I mean, you can see it looks like there's a bit of light on my face, but not quite. But the iPhone, on the other hand, yeah, it's quite the opposite. It's like it just blasts the screen and just lets your face fill up with the light, and yeah, that looks weird for some reason. Like the skin tones are off, and the brightness is maybe a little too much. It really doesn't work out for me, at least. And then night selfie portraits, let's just say that the S23 has it, the iPhone doesn't. Well, it's a fact, the iPhone doesn't have the feature. So obviously the S23 looks significantly better. I mean, it's a no-brainer right here. Now for portraits. See, there's gonna be a bit of a controversial situation over here. Maybe not controversial, but anyways, my point is this. The iPhone, it looks good. It has a lot of contrast. While the S23 Ultra, it has a more flattering look to it. I know for a fact that most people will prefer the S23 Ultra in most cases because of that very reason. But I also believe that the iPhone, it's always going to be the one that I prefer because I really like high contrast. And even in this case, like we took a 2x on the iPhone, which is sensor crop, and it looks exceptional. And then a 3x on the S23 Ultra, which again, optical zoom, it looks great. And well, I'm telling you right now, like most people will prefer the S23 because it is very flattering. Hell, even I'm really liking it. But once I see that contrast, it really draws me in on the iPhone. It just works for me. So if you're anything like me, then yeah, you will prefer the iPhone. As for the 5x, see, obviously I'm not using anything higher than 3x on the S23 in this case. The iPhone, I am trying to use a 5x, but maybe it was a particularly difficult situation, or whatever the case. I don't think it really worked out on the iPhone because somehow it couldn't really produce a proper and well exposed result. I had expected a little bit better, but I guess I was pushing things a little too far. Speaking of pushing things far, here's a backlit portrait with a ridiculously warm light falling on my face. Like, this is quite possibly one of the hardest situations I gotta put these two phones through. This is 1x zoom, of course, because in a situation like this you want to use 1x. Now, you see, this is what makes it difficult for me to make camera comparisons after a certain amount of time, because bloody hell, both phones are nailing it and it looks exceptional on both. They have their own ways of doing it. The S23 is generally brighter, so I look better, but the highlight is blown out, and it's the opposite on the iPhone. But they are doing about as good a job as I could have hoped from both. Like, it's just, yeah, I'm running out of horribly difficult lighting situations at this point. Anyways, now for night portraits, well, I would say that they are struggling a little. It was very dark, once again, but I do think that I prefer the contrast on the iPhone, naturally. But I also believe that the general detail is just a pinch higher on the iPhone. Now, both have their defects and issues. There's a bit of motion blur as well, but for the most part, I do think that the iPhone is just pulling ahead by a hair. Now finally, we have regular night mode shots, and well, I believe that the iPhone is exceptionally good with night mode, no question about that. But it also has a pretty significant, I guess, user interface problem. Because in this case, it's pretty dark, so both phones took a proper night mode shot, and I think both look good. If anything, I think the S23 is a little oversaturated, so I prefer the iPhone here. But in this case, you can probably tell that the S23 took a very nice night mode shot. The iPhone did not. For some reason, it decided that one light in the background over there, that was enough to lighten up the entire scene, and it did not need a night mode. But then when I forced it on, it took like a 2, maybe a 3-second exposure, and it just looks so much better. Like, it's definitely better than the S23. Like, the detail levels, just everything looks perfect. But once again, if the situation is dark, evenly dark with no particular bright spots or anything like that, then both will take a night mode shot. And in this case, I again prefer the iPhone because it has more contrast. Night skies are very good on the iPhones, and in this case as well, it looks really nice. I really like the color of the night sky here. Now, in this case, I do think that the iPhone kind of faced a problem. So the S23 fairly detailed, took a proper night shot, no problems. I really like the slightly lower exposure on the S23 here. It looks really nice, really aesthetic, so to speak. But when I forced on the night mode on the iPhone, once again, because that's kind of something you have to do very often. But yeah, I think it overexposed the shot in this case, and it doesn't look quite as nice anymore. But you know what I find to be absolutely criminal? Like, it is horrendous. The iPhone, in this case, it dared to believe that it could take an ultra-wide shot in low light without night mode. That's just crazy. It's horrendous, absolute insanity, because I mean, you can tell. Even if the S23 Ultra, which just has inherently bad night mode ultra-wide, if it looks better and brighter than the iPhone, then there's a problem. Because when I turned on the night mode once again manually, the iPhone looks exceptional. I've been saying that for a while now. The iPhone's night mode can be exceptional as long as you're willing to turn it on every step of the way. But it's worth it. To be entirely honest, like, this is an ultra-wide shot that looks perfectly detailed. The colors look absolutely perfect. I really like the gradient in the sky, even though it is a little oversaturated. But yeah, for the most part, it is way better than anything the S23 could fathom. Same story here. I mean, just take a look at the perfection on the iPhone as opposed to the S23, which is not quite there yet. And this is something that Samsung really needs to fix with the S24 Ultra. They need like either a good sensor or drastically better processing, because if either of those two don't happen, this is not acceptable from a $1,200 device. Just absolutely not. Now then, for a zoom. So this right here, this is 1x, and I do prefer the night sky color on the iPhone just a little bit more, but the S23 is not bad or anything like that. Now this right here is 2x. So the 2x on the iPhone, it's trying to use sensor crop, but obviously the light is not quite as much, so it's struggling a little. It's not exactly as good as the quality you would get during daytime. At 5x, it is using the 5x Tetra Prism camera, and it looks very nice. Like, the light gathering capacity of the 5x zoom camera on the iPhone, it's very good, and it works very well. At 10x, however, for anyone with a singular brain cell, including myself, would expect was that the S23 Ultra would have more detail. It would produce a better shot because 10x optical zoom. But it doesn't work at night. It really doesn't. The iPhone. Now this is very surprising here, because I didn't expect it to be this much better. I expected it to be better, to be completely fair. Yes, I did. But not this much better. Like, that looks almost as good as optical quality. And it's 10x. Like, I'm genuinely surprised here. But of course, the same cannot be said about the moon. I'm not even sure why I included the iPhone's shot over here, because it looks ridiculous. It's pointless, to be entirely honest, because it doesn't have a moon mode. The S23 does, and of course it's one of the best moon modes you can get. It looks really nice. And yeah, I get it, AI does like 90% of the work here. Let's face it, every single shot you saw previously, and every other photograph that you take with your phone, at least 50% of the processing and everything is done by some or the other kind of AI, so we're not exactly far from reality here. So anyways, that is a wrap for this comparison. Man, I can finally confidently say that the iPhones are good for photography. Finally, after I believe almost 3 years, I'm able to say that. So yeah, I'm still having a hard time processing the fact that they finally fixed this issue, even though it was way past due. So yeah, I shall be seeing you guys sooner with many more to come. Cheers.